In this video, we will discuss producer surplus and economic welfare under perfect competition. We understand from the previous video on consumer welfare that the consumer surplus is a measure of consumers' willingness to pay for the goods above what they actually pay for. So from the consumer's perspective, it is always better to have lower prices and more goods. But as a business providing goods and services to the consumers, the firm cannot simultaneously produce lots of goods and charge very low prices below their costs. In an ideal world, we would want the consumers to be able to enjoy the products and pay low prices, while the firm maintaining a reasonable profit so they can keep serving the market and also paying for their inputs, including investors, lenders, and employees. In this sense, a gauge of the total welfare of a market includes both the welfare of the consumers and of the firms. And the welfare of the firm is their profit. Under our model of perfect competition, the firms cannot have a long-run profit, although they can have short-run profits. We'll talk about these two aspects in turn. In the previous video, we made an argument that any positive profit in the market would attract more firms to enter. The new firms contribute more to the total supply, pushing down prices and reduce the profit. And the cycle goes on until the profit is totally gone. This argument, however, relies on an assumption that there are abundant firms standing by, ready to enter the market anytime. In addition to that mechanism that drives down the profit on the output market, there is potentially another mechanism that drives out the profit on the input market. And this mechanism does not necessarily rely on large amounts of standing by firms idling around trying to enter and catch the profits. This mechanism will work even if the entry to a market is limited by some scarce resources as inputs. As long as these inputs are public information among potential competitors, the profit will be driven out. Let's look at an example to see that point. Let's say that there is a piece of land sitting on an oil field that only allows production by one firm. I rented this land and I'm only paying the owner $1 in rent to make a $10 profit, gross of paying this rent. In other words, I make $9 profit after paying the rent to the owner. Now, let's say you have everything that I have, including the know-how, the equipment, everything, all but the land. What would you do? Well, you can try to outbid me to get access to the land. You probably would try to offer $2 to the owner to get access to the land instead of me. But I will certainly try to outbid you as well. If you offer 2, I'm going to offer 3, and you can see how this goes. In the end, if this piece of land is essential for production, then you will keep bidding up the price until the profit is 0. This argument shows that if access to scarce inputs provides a positive profit in the long run, then the competitors would bid away almost all the profits to gain access to these inputs. Certainly, an important implicit assumption of this argument is that these firms won't collude when they try to acquire the input. If the firms are competitive, then we can reasonably assume there is no collusion. There are real-life examples that suggest our argument is probably at work. A liquor license can cost as much as $1.6 million in some parts of New Jersey, and a hot dog stand license outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City was bid up to more than $500,000 in 2009. Why are these licenses so surprisingly expensive? Well, because the premium location that draws a large number of customers with very high willingness to pay. The high potential profit drives the competitors to bid up the price for the input. So although the hot dogs are probably expensive outside the mat, the vendor may not necessarily be the one pocketing most of the profit. Our point so far is to offer another argument that it is difficult to make a long-run profit in a competitive market. So what about the short run? In the short run, firms can make a positive profit above their variable costs. And this profit is exactly the familiar notion of producer surplus. Specifically, the producer surplus is defined by the firm's short-run profit, which is just revenue above the firm's variable cost, without considering the fixed cost. One way to interpret this is to think of the committed fixed cost as sunk, as we discussed in our previous videos. We know from our previous video on short-run competition that the firm keeps operating as long as the price is above its average variable cost, which is equivalent to the revenue is above the variable cost. In other words, the short-run profit, as we define here, is always positive. From the Principal Micro course, we learned that the producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the price, from quantity 0 up to the quantity traded. But why is this the short-run profit? Now we understand that under perfect competition, the supply curve is the marginal cost curve of the firm. These graphs below plots increasing marginal cost curves, or supply curves. As the output level increases, the marginal cost also increases. In this graph on the left-hand side, the first unit of good produced by the firm makes $4 of revenue, but only incurs $1 of marginal cost. So the marginal profit from the first unit of output is $3, or $3 of producer surplus. Onto the second unit of output, the marginal cost is slightly higher at $2, so the marginal profit reduces to $2, or $2 of producer surplus. Then $1 for the third unit of output, and $0 of producer surplus for the fourth unit. The total profit or surplus for the firm is just the sum of marginal profits added up from each and every unit of output, or the sum of the area of these many rectangles between the price and the marginal cost. So in this graph, the producer surplus is 3 plus 2 plus 1, which is $6. On the right-hand side graph, the output is continuous. So the grids become very, very fine. But we can still apply the same idea in a very similar way. The marginal cost rises as the output increases. Thus, the marginal profit decreases. The total surplus of the firm is the sum of all these marginal profits, or the sum of the area of these very thin rectangles between price and marginal cost. This gives us the green area between price and the marginal cost, which is the producer surplus for the firm. The intuition seems clear here, but it is all based on the marginal cost. So how does the producer surplus have anything to do with the variable cost? Now let's try to make this connection. Recall that we found the profit maximizing output level Q star by the condition of marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Under perfect competition, marginal revenue is just the price. And under all circumstances, marginal cost is just the same as marginal variable cost. Now, because these derivatives led us from the revenue and cost to the marginal revenue, which is price, and marginal cost, so the integral of these results should return us to something very similar to revenue and cost, or more specifically, variable cost. If we integrate the marginal revenue, which is price, with respect to quantity, we would have P times Q, and then we evaluate this integral from Q equal to 0 to Q equal to Q star, then the value of the integral becomes P times Q star, which is just the area of the big rectangle under P from Q equal to 0 all the way up to Q equal to Q star. And this is exactly the revenue of the firm at quantity equal to Q star. Similarly, we can integrate the marginal cost. But integrating the marginal cost can only recover the variable cost part, which varies with quantity. If you're familiar with the rules of integrals, you may recognize that the constant or fixed cost is indeterminate from the integral, and it drops out in the difference when we evaluate the integral from 0 to Q star. Once evaluated, what we can recover is only the variable cost evaluated at Q star minus the variable cost evaluated at 0, which is 0. Therefore, the integral of the marginal cost is just the variable cost at Q0, but it is also the size of this area below the marginal cost curve and above the horizon between Q equal to 0 up to Q equal to Q star. Therefore, the green area we marked as producer surplus is just the difference between revenue and variable cost, both evaluated at quantity equal to Q star. In other words, the area of the producer surplus is exactly the short-run profit of the firm. Now let's bring together consumer surplus, producer surplus, and debt we lost together. We're all very familiar with this graph from the principal class, but it is a very useful summary to review these concepts in a demand-supply graph and to see if we understand the meaning behind these plots a little bit better now. In this graph, the market clears at this outcome of E1, which is the competitive equilibrium outcome. In this equilibrium, the quantity traded is Q1 units, and the market price is that P1. Given the price level, the consumer surplus is the area above the price and below the demand curve, which measures the total surplus of the consumer's willingness to pay above the price they pay for. On this graph, the size of the consumer surplus is equal to the sum of area A, B, and C combined. At this price level, in a perfectly competitive market, the firm's marginal revenue is price, and the producer surplus, which is their total short-run profit, is measured by the area below the price and above the marginal cost curve, or the supply curve, which is the area of D and E combined. So in this market, the total welfare from the consumer and the firm is the total area of A, B, C, D, and E, exactly as we outlined here in this part. Now let's consider an alternative scenario where the outcome in the market is not at E1, but instead at E2 on this graph. This outcome entails a higher price and a lower quantity traded at Q2 instead of Q1. At this higher price, it will be intuitive that the consumers are worse off and the firms are better off. But how do things work out more precisely? Let's look at the details. With price at P2, the quantity traded at Q2, the consumer surplus is only the area of A, compared with the competitive equilibrium where the consumer surplus is A, B, and C combined, the consumer lost B and C. What about the firm then? At outcome E2, the firm profit increased by the gap between P2 and P1. Adding that up for all the quantities that are sold in this outcome, which is only going up until Q2, the firm gains and produces a surplus of the area B, which the firm did not have before. However, compared to E1, the firm doesn't sell as many goods anymore because the consumers aren't willing to buy as many under this higher price. So the firm loses a profit from Q2 through Q1 that was able to capture before, that was measured by the area of E. So comparing to the competitive outcome, the firm gains an area of profit in B, but loses a profit measured by the area E. So compared with E1, which is our competitive outcome, the firm gains a profit of area B, but loses area E. It seems worthwhile for the firm if they can choose where the market outcome is, because the area of size B here seems to be bigger than the area E. However, in total, the market is worse off under E2 than E1. This is because the consumers lost surplus C and the firm lost surplus E, which is never picked up by anyone. These are just surplus that could be earned by someone under a competitive outcome, but is now lost. This is why we call the area C and E the debt we lost under the market outcome of E2. As of area B, it is taken over from consumers and captured by the firms now. So although it hurts the consumers, it isn't really a loss, at least at the market level. In the principles class, in particular, it may appear that the debt we lost is a result of low output level. Many of you might have asked the question, why don't we just push up the quantity even further beyond point Q1 or E1 here? Why stop here? Wouldn't the total welfare in the market be even higher? The answer is no. A higher quantity does not necessarily mean higher market welfare. Let's look at a different graph to see this point. This graph marked a different market outcome, E2 here, which corresponds to the output level that is actually above the competitive outcome of Q1. This point E2 here corresponds to a higher quantity and a lower price of P2 comparing to the competitive outcome at E1. You might say, well, this doesn't make sense. At price of P2, the quantity traded will be limited by the supply curve. But for the sake of discussion, let's say that the outcome takes place through some external forces. Let's say the government mandates for the firm to operate at the scale of Q2, given this lower price of P2. Well, where are the consumer surplus and producer surplus? And how does the market welfare in this outcome compare to the competitive outcome of E1? First, the consumer surplus is definitely higher in this outcome than the competitive outcome. At this lower price of P2, consumers are willing to buy more units of goods. From quantities 0 all the way to Q1 that the consumers purchase under the competitive equilibrium, their surplus increased by the height between P1 and P2. So they pay that much less for each unit that they would have purchased anyways. Adding these up, the consumer surplus increased by the area of C and D combined, which is this rectangular area here marked in orange. Moreover, because of the lower price, the consumer purchased more goods than before, from Q1 all the way up to Q2. Their willingness to pay for these units are also higher than the price of P2. So they also gain additional consumer surplus on these units, which is the size of area E. Compared to the competitive equilibrium at E1, the consumer surplus increased by the area of C and D and E combined. Now, what about the producer surplus? With this lower price, the firm gets zero marginal profit at a lower quantity level, which is about here, where the price crosses the marginal cost curve. For all the units from 0 all the way up here, the firm still makes a short-run profit because the price is still more than covering their variable cost. The profit is lower than the competitive case because of the lower price. So the firm loses some producer surplus, which is about this rectangular area here on these units. But beyond this quantity, the firm starts to make a loss. The price they receive is no longer covering their marginal cost. Of course, the firms wouldn't voluntarily go there, but if they have to, they will have to suffer a loss on these outputs. From the quantity of this break-even point all the way up to this competitive quantity of Q1, the firm loses a profit in this little triangular area within C, but also now incurs a loss of the size that is measured by area D. Beyond this quantity of Q1 all the way up to Q2, the firm don't make any profits previously, so they don't lose any profits there. But now they're incurring a pure loss that is measured by this area E and B combined. Taking stock of the firm side, the producer surplus is therefore the area F, which is the positive profit, minus the areas of D and E and B combined, which are the size of the loss. Compared to the competitive equilibrium, the firm lost a profit of size C and now incurring losses in the area corresponds to B and D and E combined. Now, combining these two sides of the markets, the firm's lost profit of area C is entirely picked up by the consumers, so it isn't a loss at the market level. The loss incurred in area D and E are also picked up by the consumers, so they aren't a loss at the market level either. But the size B is the loss that the firm pays for, but benefits no one. And this is the deadweight loss in this outcome of E2 compared to the competitive outcome of E1. In this video, we discussed how competitive forces can drive out long-run profits and how the producer surplus relates to the firm's short-run profit. We mentioned that the firm would like to charge higher prices if they could, but this wouldn't be possible due to the entry of more firms or the competitive bidding on the input markets. But what if the firms in the market can act in unison and block entry of potential competitors? We can foresee the inefficiency in the market, and we will discuss the outcome in more detail under monopoly.